Welcome to Eritrea YouTube channel and nefasitpost.com newsletter. This is part one of a two-part interview with Mulugheta Abraha and his daughters, the Eritrean sisters, the brilliant Eritrean sisters, Leanda, Salina, and Haben, to talk about Mulugheta's book, The 11-Year-Old Man. To get the excellent book, I have attached a link below with the book review that tells the essence of the book. Make sure to get the book and make it part of your family shared experience. It is a must-read book for all, but especially for Eritreans. You can also read the review at the nefasitpost.com newsletter, a newsletter designed to address the issues related to the Horn of Africa, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, Sudan, South Sudan, Djibouti, and more. If you are interested in becoming part of the chain that is taking place in the Horn of Africa, if you want to understand the geopolitics, if you want to get accurate information instead of Western agenda-driven propaganda, if you are going to understand the people, cultures, and activities of the communities in the Horn of Africa, subscribe to nefasitpost.com newsletter. Click on the link below and subscribe. If you have a business that wants to reach out to the Horn of Africa communities, feel free to call 703-652-4095 to discuss the sponsorship opportunities. Or you can email aman@nefasit.com, aman@nefasit.com. To connect the Horn of Africa communities, your participation is crucial. You can contribute by subscribing, by donating, and by playing a role in any way that you can. Today, we are here with a special family, the Mulugheta Abraha's family, the father of the Eritrean sisters, the Leanda, Salina, and Haben. They are here with us to talk about this book right here, The 11-Year-Old Man. It is a special book, truly a book that every Eritrean must read to understand a period of time in Eritrean people's lives that starts in the maybe late 60s and early 70s, and what happened at that moment in the history of Eritreans, the young Eritreans at that time, what they did, Meda, how young people at that time got into Meda, everything that happened to them in Meda, in Gedli, and Sudan, and from that point to Europe and the United States, family, love, and everything else that you can think of. And it is one of the most well-written, I would say, memoirs by Eritreans about Eritrean history, about Eritrean life, in a way that is very captivating. It takes you through the stories like you were there, and this is one of the most amazing books that I've read, and I wanted to make sure that I share it with you because this is an extremely important generational book that every Eritrean must read, and especially the youth. It is the bridge that connects us with our youth. And Mulugheta Abraha did an amazing job telling his story, while telling his story, telling the Eritrean story in a way that none of us were able to do. And it's also a timestamp, something that many thousands and thousands of Eritreans went to, and he tells it from a point of strength, patriotic, lovely, disciplined, amazing human being. So without further ado, I'm going to bring the entire family here. And hi, everybody.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you. We're so happy to be here.
Mulugheta, to start with you, welcome, and please tell us whatever it is that you want to say.
Well, hey, thank you, Amaniel. First off, I definitely want to thank you for, putting this together, try to make sure that, you enlighten our community by sharing information. And not only that, trying to close the gap that we have between two generations that grew up in completely different environments. So I think you're doing an amazing job, and I truly appreciate it. And thank you for having me here and having the family. So I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and for us, this is a change. I think we're used to being on stage and Dad on the side in support, and to be here, and to have our dad kind of be a leader and saying, I want to share my story, not only with you as kids, but like with the rest of the world. That was so crazy to us. And I'm really happy that we get to be part of a conversation about how can we share our stories across generations, and all the wisdom and the knowledge and the history that comes from our ancestry. Being able to hear that, being able to be part of that, it's special.
Yeah, couldn't agree more with all of that. I think the piece of this that I've loved the most about this entire experience has really been hearing people's reactions and their responses to reading the book. And it's naturally varied depending on the generation and the people that we're speaking to. The youth, they'll, like Asmara being a perfect example. She's about, what is she? She's 13 years old and absolutely adored the book and the storytelling in it. And then also we hear from, the older generation who have a very similar story to this, and, they can relate to a lot of aspects of it. So it was just very great to see again the great response and the way people have been receiving it. So again, very grateful to be here.
Mulugheta, please tell us whatever it is that you want to tell us in terms of, about yourself, your family, anything that you want to say to introduce yourself and your family.
Yeah, so obviously my name is Mulugheta Abraham. Without the M originally, Abraha, we converted it to Abraham. There's an interesting story about that. I was born in Asmara, grew up in Asmara till age 13, and then of course, things changed and joined the revolution. We'll talk about that more. Fast forward, moved to Holland, lived there for about 13 years. In the meantime, I was, happy and lucky to have the two kids get born from love of my life. Moved to the U.S. The third got born, and we had Eritrean sisters eventually. And it is a long story that you cannot cover, but it is at the same time a story of almost every Eritrean that goes through what we have gone through. So it is not really a unique story from that perspective, but it's a story that needs to be represented, and that's why we're here talking about it. But yeah, that's a short introduction of myself.
One of the things that I noticed is that you didn't want to tell your story. You didn't want to talk about it because this is not unique to you, that everybody went through it, and that it is not something we talked about. How did you break through that mindset and ended up really forcing yourself to write it?
Interesting. So if I think back, I actually had never the intention of writing a book as such. and really, you can almost sense how the book is written. It was not a book concept. It was actually individual stories that collectively make up, the content of the book. And it all started probably in 1984 when I moved to Holland. I started, sending a message to my dad through, back then, if you remember, they're called aerogram, those blue foldable letters. And I started telling him, what I have gone through in life. And, there were so many things that he basically said, no, you need to write a book because this is getting too much. And I need to learn more about what you've done. So that one was in my mind, I need to kind of assemble my story. Fast forward, in the Eritrean sisters' lifestyle, I realized, okay, although we've been telling our kids about the story of Eritrea, the story of Eritreans, the struggle that we've gone through almost in every evening at the dinner table, the story that you can tell is not a clean story because you adjust it to their age, correct? When they're young, you leave a lot out and then slowly you add more to it, but there is no cohesive way of telling the story. So eventually I said, okay, there has to be a story that I'm going to write for the kids without any censorship, just very frank, open about who I am, who really Eritreans of my generations are, what we've gone through, and also, as a family, what we've gone through with my wife. So that story was initially meant also for them. Then in 2002, I guess, that's when I learned, oh, no, this needs to be a serious consideration for a book. And that is when I had a chance to actually, meet Minister Arnem Kial, the late Minister Arnem Kial of Minister of Transportation. And, the story of him. He had an incredible... Yeah, exactly. And, I was asking him, why don't you write a book about your history? Because that's an incredible history. And he said, no, my history is nothing compared to, others. So there's not even any reason to write a book about that. Then I realized if he cannot write a book, if all those big heroes that we respect could not write a book, then no story is going to be transferred to our next generation. So I think I need to take that risk. That's how it became a book. Now, the last inspiration and maybe encouragement was, every person that I meet, I'm talking about more the Westerners, and they hear a snippet of what we've gone through as people. They all say, no, we need a book about this. You really need to write a book about your story, about the story of Eritrea and all that. So that's what triggered me to write a book. Eventually it became a book, but it actually was written in a story format. I talk about one topic after another, and then collectively it became reasonable, covering content, so there is a lot behind it in a sense, because it is written in a very open way that to our standards almost sounds a little bit too open, because there is a lot of personal stuff in there. And for me as a person, I'm very open. The kids know it. But because this was meant for the family, there was also a lot of personal stuff in there that had to be scrutinized by the family, and eventually, in some cases, taken out, and in other cases, I fought hard to keep it because I really want to give,
So you've been censored.
Yeah, I fought hard to keep it as honest as I can, and this is not about the luckiest family on earth, and we have there are also downsides to life. So I try to be open in all aspects of my life, and that's how I wrote it.
But why the 11-year-old man? Why not anything else? Why did you name it that?
Because at the core of it, there were so many 11-year-olds that joined the struggle thinking that they were men, correct? And acting like they were men. And but you think back, and of course I had kids at 11, 12, 13. I just could not imagine that these kids could do that. But literally, those were men, except they were 11-year-olds. So I thought that would actually describe the book in its best way possible, because we're talking about a kid that is 11-year-old, joined the struggle, thinking he's a man, and then encounters all the details that I wrote about it. So yeah, that's how I wrote that book. Other than, of course, the marketing aspect of it is important. The name needs to make sense. The name needs to be captivating, and that's how we chose that name.
I saw it I saw the 11-year-old as the beginning of the trajectory of your life, and the 11-year-old signifies that beginning, and that beginning is something that is connected to the struggle for independence of Eritrea.
Absolutely.
Tell us that story, if you may, please.
So I'm sure you know those aged and seasoned people would remember. Um, this was the Wakazagar era, if you remember, Aman.
I do.
There was a day that's the day I actually got introduced to the revolution of Eritrea, when I saw huge amount of people really heading to Wakazagar. And as a 10-year-old, 11-year-old, I had no idea what was going on. But nevertheless, I decided to join with my friends and walked all the way to Wakazagar. And Wakazagar was my first eye opener to the to our fighters. That's when the first time I saw them, and I got just completely fascinated by how they looked and what they represent. And ever since, it completely changed my trajectory in life, and ended up focusing instead of school, just joining the liberation. And I'm sure, thousands did the same thing, but that is unimaginable for a 10, 11-year-old to go through that. And you see in that book I wrote a lot about, how many attempts I have made to join the struggle, and the typical response you get from the fighters, where you need to eat another quintal of death and come back. That's the standard thing. You're just not strong enough. But eventually we broke through, and made it, and joined the struggle. So between age 11 and 13, my life was actually completely consumed by just how to get out of the city and join the liberation movement. And in that process, of course, many other youngsters also joined.
I think one of the things that I found very fascinating is how sheltered you were, and how you quickly became adventurous immediately. How does that work? And how do you reconcile that? Somebody
Yeah,
that's extremely sheltered, all of a sudden you're doing all these adventures.
that's why I never trust kids that look very innocent and nice. So, and my kids know all about that. No, but I was not only sheltered, I was also extremely controlled in a sense, because my mother was really very strict, and I write about it in the book. Extremely strict, not only to me but also to the neighborhood kids. So we were always fearful of her. Nevertheless, if you have something in your mind as a kid, you cannot take it out, and your parents, if they fight it, you fight back double, correct? So to me, every time I find an opportunity, I would definitely do what I had in mind. Sheltered or no sheltered, you try to escape. In many cases, in fact, if you read, how I escaped the last time that I left Asmara, I had to wait for a moment where my mother couldn't move and try to find me wherever I was going. So literally, kids can strategize to that level. The timing, the strategy behind how to escape is incredible at that age. I look back and it's like, wow.
Obviously, your mother was pregnant, and she was immobile, and that's what you're talking about.
Yes, yes. My mother just gave birth to my youngest sister, and my father, who was in Addis, was about to join 2 days later. In Tigrinya, we call it the Ga'at celebration, correct? The Ga'at celebrations, I think it's the third day or something like that,
Wow.
where the neighborhood gets together to celebrate the birth of the baby. And I had a completely different idea that day. That is a perfect day for me to escape, because then everybody is distracted, and no grandpa is going to think about me, no one. And that worked perfectly fine. Not granted that it is painful to to my mom, and I can't even imagine how she would feel at that point. Imagine, you get a baby and then you lose a kid. That's an incredibly painful process to go through. But it just tells kids at that age, teenagers, definitely could be dangerous. They are not balanced, and that's what happened.
That is an incredible story. Just to give the listener a picture of what the city of Asmara was going through at that moment. You really detail a lot of the things that were happening. In fact, in one of the the first entries, you talk about how you saw somebody being assassinated, and that whole environment at that time. Can you, for the youth, for the young leaders like your daughters,
Hmm.
tell them what Asmara was like without getting too deep, so
Sure.
that they don't read the book, but give them at least an idea?
Yeah, and Asmara in the 1970s, early 70s, it was a city of incredible beauty, and the life of Asmara as a kid, it is almost, like it's hard to explain how it feels to walk through Kombishtato as a kid, correct? And then before you know it, things change, and Kombishtato is no longer reachable for you. Not only that, the city is completely in shambles when it comes to really the pain that people go through, the killings that were taking place, the every night the attacks that were taking place, destroying factories and attacking the garrisons and all of that. As a kid, you don't understand it, but the seriousness of it tells you when the entire neighborhood of every home almost, they actually get together every evening and pray, a collective pray. And that tells you that the city was in shock. The city was in absolute terrifying situation, and people were being killed left and right. And there are stories where in Asmara, especially the first couple of days, where people were literally in droves being buried because they were caught in the killing machine that the Ethiopians unleashed. So Asmara, as beautiful as it is, was turned to hell those days. And as a kid, you don't understand it. There is of course the limitations and restrictions where you can go. Your schools are closed. Your schools are not only closed; they're actually now inhabited by soldiers that they were brought from Ethiopia. So you had nowhere to go. Schools were closed, and cities, towns around you are being burned. So you see the smoke coming from Belaza or Kuduba, all of those places that I thought as a kid were very far, but when I went back, they're right there in front of you. And all of that made Asmara was just literally into a hell city, and you had no choice but to leave in many cases. So it is it's hard to describe actually what went on back.
I think you describe it extremely well. I think those are exactly what were happening as kids. We were scared our lives from a middle class environment, a lot of fun, people being able to walk in the middle of the night to Kombishtato eating ice cream. And all of a sudden, everybody has to go home at 6 o'clock, Koprifoco.
Before, yeah.
And you describe in the book extremely well the bombings that went on, just homes being destroyed because they were shooting from Porto.
Yeah.
And these are shared experiences, so I could clearly talk about them because it is our experiences, and you have written about it extremely well. And from that, how were you motivated to go into Meda, and what was that like? You can.
So again, for many Eritreans, the motivation was clearly, you see what the Ethiopians were doing, so no question about that. But also, for me at least, at that age, it was more your neighbors are like the youngsters that you look up to. The older ones, they're gone. Your uncles are gone. Your cousins are gone. So at that point, you feel like, what is going on here? I want to join them. You have no idea what is going on there, correct? All you know is just they went, and the stories that you hear are, hey, tanks are being burned. The Ethiopians are being crushed by the fighters, and this is how we do. So you have your own illusion and image of how things go. And you just want to join. That's it. As a kid, you don't really balance things. You don't think about I'm going to die. None of that comes to your mind. You just want to go join the club, and then a couple of months later, you're going to come liberate Asmara and back in your home. It was as naive as that when you're a 12, 13-year-old kid. But the reality is very different. The reality is, people are dying. People are, literally fighting for a long haul fight, not just like a couple of months. But for me, the motivation was genuinely just the fact that all the people that I respect and look up to are gone, and you just want to be with them, and that's how you keep yourself going to be part of that team.
I think the passion that you had to go there was amazing. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for again, looking back at that age to have developed that kind of sense of resentment against Ethiopians. The idea of you feeling a man enough to go there and fight against a machine that is an incredibly well supported machine, that is almost hard to believe. But again, I think that's what makes Eritrea's history very unique, is really the 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 unity that we had, the belongingness that we had to each other. The pain that you see is your pain. The killings that you see are people who are being killed, are your people. So all of that is even though you're a kid, you do realize that you have to do something about it. You don't know what you will do, but you join the team that is trying to fight. And for me, as I said, you go to school, you talk about that. The idea of your uncles doing miraculous things, you try to put it on pictures, you draw things, and you draw Eritrean flag and that kind of stuff that could get you killed in Asmara. But as a kid, you don't know that. And so there was something there that was just kind of burning inside you to go out and do something about it. Not to mention that the Asmara limitations that the Ethiopians putting up, like you can't play music, you can't play Eritrean music, it was forbidden. You can't use bicycles, it was forbidden. So there were so many things that you as a kid would directly be affected and can't ignore, but ask a question: why the heck? What is going on here? I want to be part of this whole movement. So yeah, those things really motivate you to move out. But I think if you knew the pain that is involved to fight in fighting, if you knew what you're going to go through, things may be slightly different at that age.
So how old were you when you joined in the struggle, and what was that like, and how did it go?
So it was. I was 13 years old when I joined, and as I said, it was on the day that Ka'at was being celebrated at home. I went out to Badorho again. Asmara was kept hostage in a sense. They were encircled by the Ethiopian military, so there were checkpoints. You have to pass those things, and we were kids, and I write a lot about it. How we went there. We crossed through Adabeto and then ended up in Badorho, and then Badorho was actually at that point kind of manned by EPLF, and we went up there and thought, hey, we want to come and join you guys. They said, no, you guys are way too big. You're small. You can't do this. Go back home. And I talk about what I don't want to talk too much about it, because in the book there is a lot of details about how we did it. But then on the way back, the story is long, but we split. We were 4 of us. We split. I joined another person that I felt was stronger. Therefore, I have a better chance of being accepted. So I ditched my 3 friends and joined the stranger that came from Denkel. And 2 of us tried to find another group, and we ended up getting no one, while the 3 that I left ended up meeting ELF fighters, and they accepted them. So on the way back, we met each other, and the story is interesting. We met each other, and they were like, how do you know each other? Well, we were one team, except these guys, we left them to go to Asmara instead. Now they joined ELF. So we were accepted by ELF, and that's the start of, a long journey to being a fighter within the ELF organization.
You are very poised for a 13-year-old kid, and I guess maybe it was the way that we were raised from your childhood. You're kind of freer to be an adult when you were back home. I think it's a lot different here. The kids are more protected. Back home, you are freer, to kind of venture out. Not in your case, but you were older, so you were still very together and poised. And how did that whole process go in the ELF, and how long were you there?
Right. So once I joined ELF, and this is the thing, that's why I kind of am a little bit reluctant to say me, because as soon as I joined, there were actually many other kids that joined as well at that point in time. So once we were in Azaga, we actually got joined by a number of people from Eritrea, from other places that were my age. So we were loaded on an Eritrean, we call them Dosfiat Eritreans, and we were taken to Mulugheta. Mulugheta was the first place where we were registered as, as accepted formally. Our name was registered where we were born and all of that. And from there on, there is no point of return, at least so I thought. And then 2 days later, we were loaded on again to Eritrea. At that point, we were probably about 100 people that were registered in Mulugheta. Probably about maybe 6 or 7 kids as in like 13, 14-year-old. We went through Habala, and in Habala, once we reached Habala, the 3 kids, that friends of mine, they decided to go back home. They couldn't handle it. So they told me, hey, we're going to go back. And I said, well, there's no way I'm going to go back now. This is my only chance to make it, as if, I got a lottery. And I refused to go back. So they went back home, all 3. And I stayed there with, another 90-something strangers, ended up traveling to Agordet by the Fiat Eritrea, the tracks. And then from Agordet, it was on foot all the way to Karkabat. That's a long story for a child to go through, but those were interesting times that I reflect back, not fondly, but somewhat amazed how that could take place. And before I forget, by the way, those 3 that left, that went back home, eventually joined EPLF, and then 2 of them actually martyred, and only 1 came back home. So, no kids were spared. Everybody was out and fighting.
But you write in the book, when you were, when you first started, you were kind of protected. They saw that you are very young, and they kind of protected you. Can you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, and that's one thing that many people don't understand, especially the Westerners. Once you join an organization like that, people think like, this are, savages, evil people that, do all kinds of harm to others. But our liberation was actually the most ethically responsible organization you can have. And you can imagine there's also our culture, when you see a kid, you're going to try to take care of it. So the care, the empathy that the fighters showed to make sure that we were taken care of is incredible. So as a kid, you don't like that because you want to be a man. You're a man and you want to fight. Therefore, nobody should really take care of you. You're out there as a man. But from their perspective, they see you're a kid. So they definitely took care of us, even during the training. Although we were trained with, and I write about this a lot, we were trained with adults. As kids, we were spared from punishments and penalties that the team gets. So we had, we have some freedom to do to act like kids. As I said, we don't like it, but once we joined the actual deployment, we joined the movement. Even then, they would take care of you. They would make sure that they share things. They give you priority. Taken care of. Even the doctors, they would make sure that even though you're not sick, they will actually, try to make sure that you're not sick. You don't get sick. So all of that was, and I write about it. Strangers, people who you don't know, but they take care of you. You are under their custody. Therefore, you're in good hands. And that's the culture. That's the environment that was cultivated in the revolution.
So you're talking about, I'm trying to figure out the time frame that you're talking about. You're 13, and you're talking about a period of what?
5 years. So literally, I stayed there for 5 years, from 13 to 18. But the first year, I would say the first year is the one that was most difficult, because you're literally a kid and you're trying to adjust to everything, and people are seeing you like literally you just came from Asmara, so you can't be a fighter. And as I said, you don't like it, but the reality is you're still a kid. You may have an AK-47 on your back, but you're still a kid and you're protected as such in that organization. But eventually we progressed and we became full-fledged fighters. Then I think in 1979 the organization decided to pull all youngsters into a camp, because they saw that there was a huge influx of youngsters from Asmara, and you can't have underage kids fight. So they basically pull us out of the deployments and put us in a camp where we were supposed to essentially get education and get training for a long haul fight. and that's what happened. And there was an organization called Merih, may have heard about it, Haytat Merih, we call them. That's when I was part of it. And then there was another group called Sabah. So those were also youngsters. The difference between those two groups were the Haytat Merih was kind of being trained to be the next military power, the leaders of the military power, while the Sabah were more into educational and things that would not have to do with military. Essentially, they would go to Sudan, they would get educated and come back becoming the next leaders, while we were more in the military environment. So we stayed there for about a year and a half actually. Unfortunately, then you remember in 1980, that's when ELF and EPLF started the war. I mean, fast forwarding here, of course, and we ended up in Sudan, in Korokon, and there is a lot of history that I wrote about it, which is you don't find a lot of people talking about that period of our history that I think I touched on, not necessarily from a political point of view, but more from how it was, what happened, and how it all transpired is what I have tried to document.
I think you touch on the political stuff too, whether it was intentional or not. It comes out because you tell how the pressure was coming up, how fast things kind of developed, and what does that entailed, and how you were trained, who was training you. So that kind of talks about the political stuff. Whether it's the Syrians have a hand of whoever was getting involved. You talk about it, but to go back one more time to that 5 years period. So that's basically like you went to high school in Meda.
in the jungle, yes, indeed.
in the jungle. And I think one of the stories that I really like is the story about how you picked up music, and I guess it's going to be very interesting to see how it may have influenced your daughter. So, just talk about that period, how that developed, and the things that were happening to lead up to that.
Yeah. So the part of music is interesting. Actually, my feeling for music started, I think, earlier because as I said, when Tigrinya music was forbidden in Asmara, I felt deprived from something beautiful. I mean, there was no question about that. But I used to go to church, Protestant church, although my parents are Orthodox, and I went to school to a Catholic all-boys school. My Sunday favorite church was actually Protestant, and there was Mehret was his name. He was a piano player, just incredibly good piano player. So for me, I was obsessed with him. Just how incredibly good he was. So that music feeling developed back. That there was no krar, there was no instrument to play, so I had nothing.
That was in Sweden, right?
Yes, it was an incredible thing. So, but once you get to Meda, then the krar is available to everybody, correct? So if you have talent, you have this 5-string instrument that you can play. And miraculously, my first couple of months, I mastered krar, and I started playing. The group would dance to my play, and I became the entertainer. Even in the prison, as I told you, I was as a guard in the prison, and the guards would actually play to my music, and that's how it started. Then eventually, when we became, this Haytat Merih group, of course, then we took it official, and there was a band set up, and me and you may know Mukhtar Saleh, who is a very famous guitar player in Asmara and a great songwriter, by the way. We became the instrument players, and we were celebrating our own right in the jungle.
So that quickly kind of went south because of the Quinat had
Right.
the infighting between the ELF and the EPLF, and you talk about some horrific stories there. Whatever you want to talk about, you can talk about, and how that kind of led to your being pushed out to Sudan.
Right.
That transition.
Yeah, and again, I keep trying to tell this my kids, the difference between ELF and EPLF. In terms of people, we're the same, correct? My uncles are on the other side, and I'm on this end. and my cousins are on the other side, and we are on this end. So technically speaking, we're the same people fighting for the same purpose, but in terms of how we were led, how the organizations were being run, there was a huge difference, and that's where the politics comes. Correct. Eventually, the difference such that only one of us could exist. Otherwise, it'd be a bloodshed once you liberate Eritrea, and then you have to fight each other. That would be a devastation. So in a way, it's a good thing that it happened back then and not after the liberation. But having said that, ELF for me has its rightful place in our history. Like any movement, it had its weaknesses, it had its problems, and especially since they were the first starters, they had to go through a lot of learning curve, and they galvanized, they spread-headed, the movement of our independence. So there is a history, rightful place for ELF. And EPLF, actually ELF gave birth to EPLF. If you think about it, EPLF is a splinter group from ELF. So ELF gave up EPLF, and to me, without ELF there would be no EPLF. Without EPLF there would be no independence. So technically speaking, without ELF there would be no independence. So that's how I relate those things. Each one of us had a contribution, and depending on how you look at it, the decisions that were made by who and all that, it becomes a political discussion. But as people, we have contributed to the overall well-being of our society by, sweating and shedding blood on all sides. Now, unfortunately, as I said, the fight between the two of us started. The historians will tell how and why it all started. But once it started, because we were so badly managed on the ELF side, even though we were fighting for 20 years before that, we couldn't stand the attacks by EPLF. So within 1 year, I remember it was August 1980, and August 1981, we were in Korokon in Sudan. So we ended up completely losing everything that we've gained, and we became almost refugee in Sudan. Our weapons were taken by the Sudanese government, by the Sudanese army, and we were sitting there trying to reorganize and go back for a year long. And I sat there waiting, while a lot of people were just escaping at that point, giving up on this struggle. I waited almost until 1981, August, I think 82 or 81, I forgot exactly what year it was. But essentially a year after we went into Sudan, I stayed there, and eventually we ended up in Kasala, Sudan. So long story there, but yeah.
It wouldn't be fair for me not to ask this question, and that is, I'll try to do it in a way that gives us enough time to discuss other things.
Sure.
The impact of that, I guess I would call it defeat. How did it impact you and people like you? And how did it manifest over the years? And because we have seen how that played out politically, and I think it would be irresponsible for me not to mention that. And if you can give people an idea what that is like and how that manifested.
Yeah. So as an individual, anyone that gets defeated, especially in a war like that, where your life, you spend 5 years and you're brainwashed, especially as a kid, you joined ELF, all you know is ELF, correct? And ELF for me is not an organization. This is people, correct? So I'm talking about Barahi, I'm talking about Walashet, I'm talking about people who really took care of me, and I belong to those people. So when those people get killed, when they die, when they get defeated, it is not an easy thing to process. And, I was fortunate enough, and many others as well, to process it and become reasonable to go back and say, okay, I need to shed the hate that I have against EPLF for what happened back then. Because you look at the overall goal was really having Eritrea be free. So if that ultimately takes place, the reason I got out of Asmara was for that purpose. It was not for ELF. I had no idea for ELF. I have no association. It's not an ethnic group or anything. It is just an organization. So from that perspective, I was able to shed that feeling of defeat and hate. I would say in about 6-7 years ish. I still wasn't there to support EPLF until almost when was that? The NATO is, I think it was 1988. I forgot exactly when it was, but when NATO got defeated, that's when I realized, okay, I think I can trust these guys. But until then, I have a good friend of mine who was ardent supporter of EPLF, and I was on the ELF side, not necessarily supporting ELF, but just not supporting EPLF. So that took a long time. But once you go see what happened, which is, these people are fighting, and these are, as I said, my uncles, my cousins on the other side, and they keep the torch moving towards liberation, then the least I could do is not being a distraction. The least I could do is not, obstruct them. So that's how I started, and eventually, of course, we all are aligned on the goal, and ended up definitely supporting EPLF and make sure that I play my role in that.
That is really great. Could you please tell us about your transition into Sudan and how that kind of elevated it to the next stage of your life?
So once in Sudan, again, as an ELF fighter, there were another 20,000 people that came from ELF in Sudan. So we were, as a family of 20,000, essentially immigrated to Sudan. So once in Sudan, you're actually, again, taking care of each other. Even though you're out of the jungle, in Sudan, you still take care of each other. If you find any Eritrean that comes to Kassala or Khartoum, he doesn't have to worry about not having a shelter or food, because any Eritrean will take care of you. And in my case, I was lucky enough to have an uncle. I've had an uncle in Tanedba. It's called the refugee camp. So he took me to Tanedba, lived there for a year in a hut where, probably the poorest lifestyle I've ever had was in that village. But reflecting back, probably also the happiest time of my life was in that village. So poor doesn't necessarily mean unhappy, is I guess where I'm heading with this. But once I went out of
Sudan, right?
I'm talking about Sudan, that village, Tanedba or Abu Rakham, they call them, those are refugee camps. All you see is just sea of huts in completely dirty, I can't say more than that. It's really not a place to live in, correct? You're literally living next to donkeys and goats and you name it. But, I enjoyed it in a sense that it allowed me to discover myself, to discover my hobbies. For the first time, I learned that I can actually draw nicely. I can have artwork. And in Sudan, that talent actually made me money. I actually had a job drawing and creating artwork, which was surprising. So, I stayed there for a year. There's a lot of details, but eventually made it out of Sudan to Europe. And I had a chance to go to America through the American Resettlement Program. I didn't use that. There was another chance that came and I took it. And I'm glad I took it because it landed me in Europe, and my life turned out the way it is right now because of that.
It's really interesting. Maybe you noticed it throughout your journey as you wrote your book, that you kind of discovered yourself, your talents, your abilities during the adventures. You're talking about the drawing, the music. To be able to do that, you were discovering yourself in the process. And where is Togorba in relations to Khartoum or to the other parts of Sudan? And how did you ended up going to
Tanedba?
From Tanedba to Khartoum, and then from there out of the country?
Right. The Tanedba and Abu Rakham is actually, it's almost Gadaref, and then you go to the west, so towards Ethiopia. It's almost towards the border of Ethiopia. So it's pretty far away, isolated. And the Tanedba specifically was actually inhabited by refugees from Tigray. So if I'm not mistaken, you may have found 10 or 20 Eritreans, but the entire village was from Tigray. Abu Rakham, on the other hand, that was actually inhabited by Eritreans. But nevertheless, I think it was, as I said, it was a good life. I discovered myself. But more importantly, also, there was one thing that triggered my life to change the way it has, which was a letter I received from my dad. The first letter I received from my dad after 5 years of going, missing in action. it really talks about, how my sisters, uh, their school grades, how they evolved and all that. And he was just telling me how everybody's doing. But for me, it was a dose of reality that says, wait a minute. So 5 year long, I was in the jungle while everybody was actually being educated. And that opened a huge light in my head. Said, okay, so I'm really behind. I was actually not making progress in life. So even though I may have progressed in terms of maturity, in terms of other experience, but education wise I was behind. So that really put a fire in me to deep find deep the strength and desire to learn. And it started literally in Tanetba. Even in Tanetba, I write about, okay, I need math books, and any book that you can give me, I told it Barak, so I can learn things. So the desire starts right there where we had nothing. Uh, but
So
that led.
to know why you're ready to get out of Sudan and resume your life is what it sounds like.
Yeah, and I was not even worried about how I get out of Sudan. For some reason, I thought that was a given. Everybody's going out of Sudan, so I will eventually get out of Sudan. But my problem was, once I get out of Sudan, what happens? Where do I go? And last I know in terms of education, I was a seventh grader in Asmara. Between now, seventh grader, and 5 years later, I'm probably going back to fourth graders because I forgot everything. Correct. So I did a lot of funny stuff there to make sure that my chances of being accepted in Europe as a seventh grader is high. And I write about how I actually created and do I have it here? I don't have it here. But I actually got a certificate for myself. I gave a certificate for myself that says, hey, Mulu has actually completed eighth grader, so I can go into anywhere else. I can show them that certificate that I have actually completed, so I can get accepted in high school. I went to that extent, to just make myself somehow an educated person, just to give me a little chance of getting one foot in the door. Smaller things like that. Now I laugh about it, but it is actually the fire that is in you that drives you to do those kind of things. And I think that fire lasted long enough to have me, complete the education that I wanted to finish to complete.
By then, you were reconnected with your parents. You were exchanging letters,
Yep.
and you are motivated to. I think they were part of the motivation.
Big part, especially my dad was, he's a well-educated man. He was running the airport as airport manager. He was air traffic controller, by the way, one of the first air traffic controllers, Eritrean air traffic controllers that got educated abroad and served in airport Asmara. So, I'm lucky to have him as my advisor through those aerograms, as I said. And for me, because of that drive that I had, anything he said, I'm going to put 150% effort. And my kids, I don't know if you guys have done that, but it's a good thing to do.
We're gonna bring them to talk about it. I think we almost getting there. We're almost getting there.
So,
And they're not born yet. They're not even
no,
considered yet.
they're not born then.
They're just maybe a step away. We're
Correct.
gonna come to that.
But definitely, so that really put a fire in me, to just get educated. And my dad had a massive role to play in terms of advice, in terms of what I need to do and things of that nature. But ultimately it comes down to the effort that you put. And I was fortunate enough to be in a position to put the effort and to get the guidance from people around me. So that's definitely helpful.
I think one of the things that we must talk about is that our journey, the Eritrean journey, is collective. What you went through, I went through.
Yeah.
Your experiences are my experiences, maybe not identical, but parts of it are the same or similar.
Yeah.
And so everything that you tell, the stories that you tell are very uniform, especially for the people that transition in that period. And you talk about the camaraderie, the support of Eritreans, how they supported each other, and what that culture was like. For this young generation, is there any way you can impart a little bit of that knowledge?
Yeah, and I think to a certain extent, definitely, you guys, my kids, have seen it, where we as people have something unique in our value, and that is helping each other. Correct. In bad times, that it is not about me having a family member. No, just being Eritrean by itself is good enough to support each other. And we go even beyond that. We go to the Habesha, we go to Sudan. You included. We're very culturally extremely helpful people, and we have the right values in terms of what it means to be a human being, and we try to exercise that wherever we go. But I think in bad times it shines beautifully, because that's when you see the best of us. And I have seen the best of humanity really represented by Eritreans in Sudan, by Eritreans in the in the jungle, even in to a certain extent in Europe as well. Uh, Definitely, that's deep in who we are in our culture, and I think it is extremely important that we pass that, at least a portion of it, to the next generation, to help each other. And I'm happy to see that. We'll talk about that later in our kids, where they collectively help each other, not only as kids but also extended Eritreans and other people that they deal with. But yeah, that's our trait. That's our almost trademark, really helping each other.
I think that's one thing that sustained us.
Yeah.
How did you ended up in Holland, and what was that transition like, and how did you adjust? If you can talk about it.
Yeah, Holland was an interesting country. Well, the of course, like any Eritrean, you end up somewhere in a country that you have never heard of. So I've never heard of the country Holland when I landed in Holland. So it's a long story, but the trip itself is not the thing. It is more, once you land in Holland, then what happens, correct? So in my case, I think I have probably received the worst kind of culture shock you can get as an Eritrean, which is, I landed in Holland, and there was an organization that takes care of refugees, and they have to give you a shelter, a temporary shelter. And I was lucky enough or unlucky enough to get a shelter right in the middle of the red light district, literally in a homeless shelter, where it opens at 9 in the evening and it closes at 9 in the morning. And during the day, you just roam the streets. And I lived there for 2 weeks in the red light district, trying to understand where the heck did I land. And there was no one there at that point, no Eritrean, no one. Literally, all I have is just those bunch of homeless that sleep with me at night, and during the day, I'm going to roam like them, just wherever we go. And it was in October, so it was pretty cold actually, and I was not dressed well. Fortunately, I've got to give incredible credit for the organization in Holland called VVN. That is essentially the organization that receives us as refugees and tries to help you navigate through the social challenge, including taking care of your outfits and all of that. They've done an amazing job, but for me it was quite a culture shock to process Holland, especially Amsterdam, compared to where I come from culturally, value-wise, and especially prostitution is not something that is commonly known in Eritrea. And when you see that in Holland and almost being seen as a tourist attraction, it is hard to process. You just came from the jungle, literally, and then you landed in this place where it is so complex, so sophisticated. You cannot process it. And I'm sure some of it was probably just disappearing. I have no idea what I was thinking at that point. But once in Holland, though, I think I can tell you that Holland has a great things about it and the drawbacks. The great things are there is an amazing social fabric that supports you. The infrastructure there is great. The bad part is the infrastructure is so great that it almost paralyzes you because you become so dependent on the social welfare system. You can't do much, and unless you really see through that, you can get stuck, and it can take you a long time before you get out of it. That was a problem, but the good thing is, at least for the short term, the country actually takes care of you really well. Back then, things have changed, of course, but back then, there was great support for refugees, and I have been lucky enough to have make use of it. and fortunate enough to actually have benefited from it.
You talk about some great people that helped you along the way, like the lady that housed you as you were educated, how you got into through the education process.
Yeah.
Determination is, I think, something that you can talk about that I think is very inspirational, especially coming from the kind of background that you came
Yeah.
and not having any knowledge of the language, and to be able to get into the education process and how that transpired is, I think, very inspirational, and that people should know.
Yeah, in a way, it was interesting thing that I knew nothing. It was actually somewhat an advantage that I knew nothing, because I came with a blank canvas to just learn anything that I can get correct. If I had like high school finished, or maybe enter university and all that, I come to Holland and they tell me to learn ABCD, because ABCD is not ABCD. This is called something else. That's hard, correct? But for me, it was like I'm starting from scratch, and anything I learn is a new thing for me. So it was an advantage in a sense, because I remember, number of Eritreans that came later, especially because they had already university, attended university or high school. It was a struggle for them to go back and to learn the basics of the language, which is literally you start with ABCD, they call it ABCD, which is a very hard thing to do for them. For me, it was an advantage, but yet I think the mindset was very important. The mindset of okay, I can actually get out of this this dependency. I can make a long-term plan. Now I think about it, it's almost hard to believe I was making a 10-year plan to finish, to complete my education. I'm thinking like, who does 10-year plan when you just arrive in Holland? It's crazy. Fortunately, for some reason, I had a 10-year plan with my dad, where I'm going to go from 7th grade all the way to being a bachelor's degree. It's crazy, you think about it, but when you have the level of perseverance that we had in the jungle, correct? If you think about it, that must have helped incredibly, because if I can survive for 5 years in the jungle under incredibly, hard conditions, how hard is it for me to survive under a luxury circumstance where my future is going to be improved? I should have, I have a way to use it. So I think it must have helped me a lot. Now, the bad thing is, once you're in Holland, you could also get very easily distracted. There are so many things in life that could distract you from your goal. And, as I said, I'm fortunate enough to have chosen what I have chosen. I have had the support that I have, support from my parents, as well as my family in Holland. As I said, I call them family, the Dutch family that I stayed with. But it goes back to, I think, the fire that was triggered by my dad still when I was in the jungle. That for me is, I think, the key thing. You have to have somehow a motivation, and that motivation, that one letter, for me lasted over 10 years. Is, I think, how I read my situation in Holland.